On a high cliff above the sea, an old king stood watching the horizon, as he had stood watching every day for many days, waiting for a single ship to come home. He was watching for the color of a sail. His son had promised him a sign, a white sail if he lived, a black sail if he had died. And so each morning the old man climbed to the edge of the cliff and searched the empty water for the little shape that would tell him whether his boy was alive or dead. This is a story about a monster in the heart of a maze, and the young hero who went into the dark to kill it. But it is also, from its very first breath to its very last, a story about remembering and forgetting, about a thread that leads a man safely out of the darkness, and a promise forgotten in the joy of victory that would cost more than any monster ever could. For the deepest truth of this tale is a strange and quiet one. The hero survives the labyrinth. He survives the monster. And then he is undone, at the very end, not by any enemy at all, but by a single thing he forgot to do. To understand how a young man came to sail toward a monster at the edge of the world, and how an old king came to be standing on that cliff searching the sea, we must go back to the beginning, to a curse, and a bull, and a maze, built to hide a shame that a proud king could not bear to look upon. It begins on the island of Crete, the greatest sea power of that ancient age, ruled by a proud and mighty king named Minos. Minos wished to prove to all the world that the gods themselves favored his claim to the throne. And so he prayed to Poseidon, the lord of the sea, to send him a sign. A bull, he asked, a perfect bull to rise up out of the waves, which he would then sacrifice back to the god in thanks. And Poseidon heard him, and out of the sea there came a bull of dazzling, flawless, white, so beautiful that it took the breath from everyone who saw it. It was a gift beyond price, a clear sign of heaven's favor. And all that the god asked in return was that the beautiful creature be given back to him upon the altar, as Minos had promised. But when Minos saw the bull, and saw how perfect it was, something small and greedy stirred in his heart. Surely, he thought, one bull was much like another. Surely, the god would not mind if he kept this magnificent creature for his own herds, and sacrificed some lesser beast in its place. And so he did. He kept the beautiful bull, and he offered up an ordinary one. And he told himself that God would never know the difference. It is the oldest mistake in all these stories, the belief that we can take the gift and cheat the giver, that we can keep the blessing and withhold the thanks. And the gods in these tales always know. Poseidon knew. And his anger, when it came, did not fall upon Minos directly. It fell, as the anger of the gods so often does, upon someone innocent, in a way so strange and so cruel that it would haunt the house of Minos for generations. For Poseidon's revenge was this. He caused Pasiphae, the wife of Minos, the queen of Crete herself, to be seized by an unnatural and consuming passion for the white bull. It was a madness sent by the god, a curse she had done nothing to deserve, and it drove her to a desperate and shameful act. She went to the greatest craftsman who had ever lived, a man named Daedalus, an inventor of such genius that there seemed to be nothing his hands could not make, and she begged him to help her. And Daedalus, who served the whims of the royal house, and perhaps did not fully consider what he was setting in motion, built for her a device, and, by its means, the queen lay with the bull. And from that monstrous union, in time, a child was born. But it was not a child as any child had ever been. It had the body of a man, strong and terrible, and the head and shoulders of a bull, with horns and hungry eyes, and it grew, as it aged, into a creature of enormous strength and savage appetite, a thing that could not speak, and could not be reasoned with, and would eat nothing but the flesh of human beings. They called it the Minotaur, the bull of Minotaur, and it was the living shame of the royal house, the visible proof of a curse, and a queen's madness, and a king's broken promise. And Minos could not bring himself to kill it, and could not bear to let the world see it. And so he turned once again to Daedalus, and he set the great craftsman his most famous task of all, to build a prison from which the monster could never escape, and in which the shame of Crete could be hidden away forever. What Daedalus built was the labyrinth. It was not a simple dungeon or a cage. It was a maze, the greatest maze ever conceived. A vast and bewildering tangle of passages and turnings and false paths, of corridors that doubled back upon themselves, and led nowhere, so intricate and so cunningly made, that even Daedalus himself, the man who designed it, could barely find his own way out of it, once he was inside. Into the heart of this maze they drove the Minotaur, and there it lived, in the darkness at the center of all those winding paths, roaring and hungry, unable ever to find its way out, and unable ever to be reached, except by those who were sent in to die. For the labyrinth was not merely a prison. It was a place of execution, and the victims who were fed to the monster in the dark came, by a cruel twist of history, from across the sea, from the great city of Athens. Some years before, the son of King Minos had gone to Athens and been killed there. And Minos, in his grief and his rage, had made war upon the Athenians and defeated them, and imposed upon them a punishment more terrible than any tribute of gold. Every 9 years, he decreed, the city of Athens must send to Crete 7 of its finest young men and 7 of its most beautiful young women. 14 children of its family supped to be driven in city's best families, in its the labyrinth, and lost in its winding dark, and devoured by the monster at its heart. Picture the horror of it, settling over Athens as the 9th year came round again. 14 young lives, chosen from among the flower of the city, sent across the sea to a foreign island to be swallowed by a maze, and eaten by a thing that was half a man. There was no fighting it. Crete was too strong. There was only the drawing of the lots, and the weeping in the houses of the chosen, and the black-sailed ship of mourning waiting in the harbor to carry the children away to their deaths. And it was into this grief, into this city, living under the shadow of its terrible debt, that the hero of our story now came at last, a young man arriving in Athens, unknown, to claim a father he had never met, just as the 9th year and the 3rd dreadful tribute came due. His name was Theseus, and to understand him we must go back a little, to a town called Troezen, across the water from Athens, where he had been raised by his mother without ever knowing for certain who his father was. But his mother knew, for his father was Aegeus, the king of Athens himself, who had passed through Troezen years before, and who, before he left, had done a curious thing. He had lifted a great heavy stone, and beneath it he had placed his own sword and his own sandals. And he had told the boy's mother that when their son was grown, if he was strong enough and worthy enough to roll away the stone and take up what lay beneath it, then she should send him to Athens to claim his birthright as a prince. And so Theseus grew up beside that stone, knowing that his manhood and his destiny lay hidden beneath it. And when at last he was grown and strong, he set his shoulder to the great rock, and heaved it aside, and took up his father's sword and sandals, and turned his face toward Athens to claim the father and the kingdom that were his. But his mother and his grandfather begged him to go the safe way, by sea, a short and gentle crossing. Theseus refused, for the land road to Athens was long and famously deadly, infested with monsters and murderous bandits, who preyed on every traveler, and no one dared to walk it. And that was exactly why Theseus chose it. He was young and hungry to prove himself, and he had heard the tales of the great hero Heracles, and he longed to be a hero of that same kind. And a hero, he knew, is not made on the safe and easy road. He is made on the dangerous one. And so he set out to walk the road that everyone else avoided, straight into the teeth of every terror that waited along it. And the road did not disappoint. One after another, Theseus met the monsters of that highway, and one after another he destroyed them. And in each case, he did something that revealed the particular shape of his heroism. For he did not simply kill these villains. He killed each of them in the very same way that they had killed their own victims, turning their cruelty back upon themselves, so that the punishment fit the crime exactly. First, there was Periphetes, a savage who beat travelers to death with a great club of bronze. Theseus took the club from him and struck him down with it, and carried it ever after as his own. Then there was Sinis, called the Pine Bender, who would bend 2 great pine trees down to the ground and tie his victims between them, and then let the trees spring back, tearing them apart. Theseus caught him and bent the pines, and tore him apart upon them exactly as he had done to so many others. There was a monstrous wild sow that ravaged the countryside, and Theseus slew it. There was Sciron, who forced travelers to kneel and wash his feet at the edge of a high cliff, and then kicked them over the edge into the sea, where a giant turtle waited to devour them. Theseus sent him over that same cliff to the same waiting jaws. There was Cercion, who forced all comers to wrestle him to the death. Theseus wrestled him and won, and gave him the death he had given so many. And last and most famous of all, there was Procrustes, the stretcher, who offered weary travelers a bed for the night. But it was a terrible bed, for if the traveler was too short for it, Procrustes would stretch him on a rack until he fit, and if he was too tall, he would cut off whatever hung over the edge, so that no guest ever left his house alive. And Theseus laid Procrustes down upon his own dreadful bed, and gave him the measure he had given to so many others. There is a grim poetry in that road, and the old tellers lingered over it, for each of those 6 deaths was a little parable in itself. Sinis the Pine Bender had made a cruel game of the strength of the earth, using the living trees to tear men in half for his amusement. And so the trees tore him. Siren had made travelers kneel before him in false humility, and washed his contempt for them in the sea below, and so the sea took him. Procrustes, most memorably of all, had a philosophy of cruelty, that every man could be made to fit his iron bed, if only you were willing to stretch him, or cut him down to size, and there is something in that image that has haunted people for 3,000 years, the tyrant who forces the whole world to fit his own rigid measure, and destroys whatever will not. Theseus laid each of them in the bed they had made for others, and by the time he reached Athens, he was no longer an unknown boy from Troezen. He was a name, a rising hero, the young man who had walked the road of death and cleansed it, so that ordinary travelers could pass in safety ever after. That, too, is part of what a hero was in the old understanding. Not merely a killer of monsters, but one who makes the road safe for the people who come behind him, who takes the danger onto himself so that others need not face it. It was the noblest thing in Theseus, this willingness to walk into the danger for the sake of others. And it was the very thing that would soon send him, of his own free will, onto a ship bound for a monster in a maze. Consider, for a moment, what this pattern was quietly saying about the young hero. Theseus did not merely defeat evil. He returned it precisely and exactly to the ones who had made it. There was a fierce and rigorous sense of justice in him, a belief that the cruelty a man deals out is the cruelty he deserves to receive. It was a noble quality, and it made him a hero. But there is a hardness in it, too, a certain unbending severity, and it is worth holding on to for a strain of that same hardness. That same forgetting of mercy will run quietly through the whole of his life and shadow its end. And so, having cleared the deadly road of all its terrors, Theseus came at last to Athens. Famous now, his name already running ahead of him, but still unknown to his own father. And here he walked into a danger more subtle and more poisonous than any bandit on the road. For King Aegeus, in his lonely old age, had taken a new wife, and she was none other than Medea. Yes, that same Medea, the sorceress of Colchis, who had won the golden fleece for Jason and been cast aside by him, and who had now come to Athens and made herself queen at the side of the aging Aegeus. And Medea, with her witch's arts, knew exactly who this famous young stranger was. She knew he was the king's own son, come to claim his inheritance, and she saw in him a threat to her own power and to the future of any child of her own. So she went to the old king, who did not recognize his son, and she filled his ear with suspicion, whispering that this famous young man was surely a spy, an assassin come to seize the throne, and that he must be dealt with before he could strike. And she persuaded Aegeus to offer the young hero a cup of welcome, a cup that she had filled with deadly poison. Theseus came to the feast, and the poisoned cup was set before him, and he lifted it to his lips. But at the last moment, meaning to reveal himself, he drew his sword to cut the meat, his father's sword, the very sword that had lain beneath the stone in Troezen. And Aegeus saw it. In an instant, the old king knew that blade, knew it as his own, and understood, with a father's sudden terror, exactly who was sitting before him, and exactly what was in the cup. And he struck it from his son's hand, before the poison could touch his lips. Father and son were reunited in the very same heartbeat, that they were nearly parted forever, and Medea, her scheme exposed, fled from Athens and passed out of the story. It was the narrowest of escapes, and it is a strange and telling thing that the greatest danger Theseus faced on his whole journey to his father was not a monster on the road, but a cup of wine in his father's own hall, offered with a smile. Sometimes the deadliest labyrinths are the ones inside a house, but Theseus had come to Athens at a dark hour, and he had not been reunited with his father for long before the shadow fell over the city once again. For the 9th year had come round, and the ship with the black sail lay waiting in the harbor, and it was time once more for Athens to choose 14 of its children and send them across the sea to be devoured by the monster in the maze. Theseus watched his new city drown in grief, watched the lots drawn, watched the families weep, watched the young men and women marked for the labyrinth walk toward the harbor like the dead. And he could not bear it. And so he made a decision that horrified his father. He would go himself. He would be one of the 7 young men sent as tribute to Crete. And once inside the labyrinth, he would find the Minotaur, and he would kill it. And he would end the terrible debt forever, so that no more children of Athens would ever have to die in the dark. Aegeus begged him not to go. He had only just found his son. He could not bear to send him straight to the monster's jaws. But Theseus would not be moved. This was exactly the kind of deed he had come into the world to do, and he would not stand safely by while others died. And so, seeing that his son could not be dissuaded, the old king asked only one thing of him. The ship that carried the tribute to Crete always sailed under a black sail, the color of mourning. Aegeus gave the captain a second sail, a white one, and he made his son a promise, and asked for one in return. Watch for the ship's return, Theseus told him, and if I have failed, and I am dead, let it come home under its black sail as always. But if I have lived, if I have slain the monster, and I am coming home to you, then change the sail to white, so that you will know, from far off, the moment you see it on the horizon, that your son is alive. Aegeus agreed, and he stood on the shore and watched the black-sailed ship carry his newfound son away across the sea. And he began his long and anxious waiting, counting the days until a sail should appear again on the horizon, and praying with all his heart that when it came, it would be white. Remember that white sail. Hold on to it. Everything, in the end, will come down to it. The voyage across the sea to Crete was a voyage of the doomed, and it is not hard to imagine the mood aboard that black-sailed ship. 13 of the 14 were children going to their deaths, and they knew it, and they wept, or sat silent, or clung to one another as the shore of home sank away behind them, and the unknown island of the monster rose ahead. Only one among them was not afraid, and that was Theseus, who stood in the prow and looked toward Crete, not as a victim, but as a hunter, turning over and over in his mind how a man might do the thing that no man had ever done. His calm must have been a strange comfort to the others. This one young man among them who did not weep, who spoke of killing the monster as though it were a thing that could actually be done. And when the ship at last, came into the great harbor of Crete, the mightiest sea power in all the world. The Athenian children saw the wealth and the strength of the kingdom that held them in its grip. The vast palace, the painted walls, the ships beyond counting, and their hearts must have sunk still further, for what hope could a handful of foreign captives have against so great a power? The 14 young Athenians were brought before King Minos to be inspected like cattle before the slaughter, and among them stood Theseus, tall and proud and unafraid. And Minos looked upon this bold young man who would not lower his eyes, and something passed between them, the wary measure that passes between a king and the one man in the room who does not fear him. There are old tellings that say Theseus, even here, would not play the meek victim, that when one of the Cretans insulted the Athenian captives, he answered back with the pride of a king's son, and even set some proof of his own divine descent against the pride of Minos, so that the young hero came into that hall of his enemies, not crawling but blazing. It was the same fierce spirit that had cleared the deadly road, and it did not desert him even in the shadow of the maze. But pride alone does not solve a labyrinth, and courage alone does not walk a man out of the inescapable dark. For all his boldness, Theseus stood that day under the same sentence as the weeping children beside him, to be driven, when the time came, into the winding stone and lost there, and devoured. What he needed was not more courage. It was help, and that help, unlooked for, was watching him even now from among the shadows of her father's court. And there, in the court of Minos, another pair of eyes fell upon the young hero. The eyes of Ariadne, the daughter of the king, a princess of Crete. And, as had happened once before in a faraway kingdom, as it would happen again and again in these old tales, the princess looked upon the foreign hero, come to face her father's monster, and she fell in love. But Ariadne's love was not the helpless, God-sent madness that had seized Medea in Colchis. It was a quieter and a braver thing. She looked at this young man, doomed to be lost in the maze her own father's shame had built, and she could not bear to see him die, and she resolved to save him, knowing, as she must have known, that to save him was to betray her father, and her home, and her whole world, and to place her entire life in the hands of a stranger who would sail away at dawn. In secret, she went to Theseus in the night, before he was to be driven into the labyrinth, and she made him an offer. She would give him the means to survive the maze and slay the monster, and, most importantly of all, to find his way back out again. For the labyrinth killed even those it did not feed, to the Minotaur, swallowing them in its endless turnings until they starved, lost forever in the dark. And in return, she asked only that he take her with him when he fled, and make her his wife, and carry her away from Crete to a new life in Athens. And Theseus, looking at the brave princess who was offering to save his life, swore that he would. He gave her his promise. And Ariadne, trusting him, gave him two things. She gave him a sword to kill the monster, and she gave him a ball of thread. Before we follow him into the dark, stay a moment with Ariadne, standing in the night with a sword and a ball of thread in her hands. For she is easy to pass over, and she should not be. Think of what she was doing. She was the daughter of the most powerful king in the world, a princess in a palace of wealth and safety, with everything before her. And she was about to throw all of it away in a single night for a foreign stranger she had known for the space of a few days. To give Theseus the thread was to betray her own father, to make herself an enemy in her own home, to side with the killer of her own half-brother, the Minotaur, monstrous though he was. It was to gamble her entire life, her whole future, on nothing but the promise of a man she barely knew and could not truly trust. She must have known, some clear-eyed part of her must have known, how these things so often go, that a hero who sails away at dawn does not always remember the girl who saved him. And she did it anyway. That is a kind of courage we do not always honor in these tales, because it is quiet, and it wins no battles, and it kills no monsters. It is the courage of the one who gives, who hands over the thread, and the sword, and the secret, and their own safety with it, and asks, in return, only to be remembered. Everything Theseus was about to do, every scrap of the glory he was about to win, was being placed in his hands, in the dark, by a young woman who was giving up her whole world to do it. And the tale, which will not let us forget it, is quietly asking us to notice her now, because the hero, so very soon, is going to forget her entirely. The thread was the key to everything. It was the answer to the maze, the one simple, humble thing that could defeat the greatest labyrinth ever built. Ariadne had gone, in secret, to the very man who had designed the labyrinth, the great craftsman, Daedalus himself, and she had begged him for the secret of escaping it. And Daedalus had told her, "There is no cleverness that can solve the maze from within, no memory that can hold all its turnings. The only way out is to never lose the way in. Tie one end of a thread at the entrance," he said, "and unwind it behind you as you go wherever the passages lead, and then, when the deed is done, simply follow the thread back, and it will carry you out of the dark." And so, when they drove Theseus into the labyrinth with the other 13, he did as Ariadne had told him. He tied the end of the thread to the door at the entrance, and he began to walk into the maze, unwinding the ball behind him as he went, deeper and deeper into the winding stone corridors, into the turnings and the doublings back and the false paths, into the thickening dark where the light of the entrance faded away to nothing, and the air grew close and foul and heavy with the smell of the thing that lived there. He walked, and the thread trailed out behind him, his one fragile link to the world of the living and the light. And somewhere in the heart of that darkness, he began to hear it. The breathing, and then the movement, and then the low animal sound of the Minotaur, which had caught the scent of him and was coming. Pause for a moment, and imagine that walk into the dark, for the old tellers meant us to feel it. There is no torch in most tellings, or if there is, its little flame only deepens the blackness beyond its reach. There is only the cold stone under his hands, the endless turnings that all feel the same, the terrible sameness of a place designed to steal away all sense of where you are and where you have been. A man in that maze loses first his direction, and then his hope, and at last his very self, until he is nothing but a frightened animal wandering in the dark, which is exactly what the labyrinth was built to do. For it was a machine for making men helpless before they were ever devoured. And behind Theseus, thin as a whisper, ran the one thing that kept him a man and not a lost beast. The thread, unspooling quietly in the dark, tying him still to the door and to the light and to the girl who waited beyond it. He followed the sounds of the monster inward, toward the center, toward the thing that all those turnings had been built to hide. And the smell grew stronger, and the breathing grew louder, and the dark grew somehow darker still, until he came at last into the open space at the heart of the maze, and knew, though he could barely see it, that he was no longer alone. And so, at the center of the maze, in the dark, the hero and the monster met at last. It was an enormous thing, far stronger than any man, with the horns and the fury of a maddened bull, and the grasping hands of a man, and it fell upon Theseus with all its savage hunger. What followed was a desperate struggle in the blackness, the young man and the beast. And the old stories differ on exactly how it went. Some say Theseus struck it down with Ariadne's sword, and some say he had no weapon at all and killed the monster with his bare hands and fists, beating it down by sheer courage and strength. However it was done, it was no easy victory. Picture the two of them in that black arena at the center of the world's cruelest maze. The monster that had never known defeat, that had grown vast and terrible on the flesh of the children of Athens. And the single young man who had come, alone and half-blind in the dark, to end it. The creature was faster than its size, and stronger than any 10 men, and it fought with the blind ferocity of a thing that had never been challenged, its horns sweeping through the dark, its hands closing, where a moment before Theseus had stood. And Theseus fought as he had fought all his life, with everything in him, wrestling and striking and enduring, using the darkness now as his ally, slipping the monster's rushes, waiting for the single opening that would let him end it. It was the hardest fight of his life, harder than any band did on the road. For here there was no cleverness that could substitute for sheer courage, held steady in the pitch dark against a thing built to make brave men break. But he did not break. But however it was done, in the end the Minotaur lay dead upon the stone floor at the heart of its terrible prison, and the young man stood over it, bloodied and gasping and alive. The monster that had devoured the children of Athens for a generation, the shame of Crete, the horror at the center of the maze, was slain at last. And now came the part that the maze had been built to make impossible: getting out. Any other victor, having killed the beast, would still have died there in the dark, wandering the endless corridors until his strength failed. But Theseus turned, and in the blackness his hand found the thread, the humble thread, trailing away behind him into the dark, and he began to follow it back, turning by turning. Corridor by corridor the thread led him unerringly back, through all the bewildering tangle of the labyrinth, back the way he had come, back toward the faint, far light of the entrance, where Ariadne was waiting. And here is the thing worth pausing over. In the middle of all this triumph, it was not Theseus's strength that got him out of the maze, though his strength killed the monster. It was the thread. It was a gift given to him by someone who loved him, that carried him out of the darkness alive. The greatest hero in the world, alone in that maze, would have wandered and died like all the others. What saved him was that he had been given a thread to follow and had the humility to follow it. Remember that too. Remember who gave him the thread, because the story is about to test whether Theseus remembers it himself. He came out of the labyrinth alive with the other Athenian youths, and Ariadne was waiting, and in the confusion and the darkness they gathered up the freed prisoners and fled to the harbor, and boarded their ship, and slipped away from Crete under cover of night. Out onto the open sea, and toward freedom and home. Theseus had done everything he set out to do. He had slain the monster and freed the children of Athens, and ended the terrible tribute forever. And he was sailing home a hero with the brave princess who had saved his life beside him exactly as he had promised. It should have been the happy ending of the tale. But it was not, for on the voyage home, the ship put in at an island called Naxos to rest and take on water. And there something happened that has never been fully explained, and that stains the honor of Theseus forever. While Ariadne slept on the shore of Naxos, Theseus and his companions boarded the ship and sailed away, and left her there. They left her sleeping, alone, on the shore of an empty island, the princess who had given up her home and her family and her whole world to save him, the woman who had handed him the thread that carried him out of the dark. He sailed away and left her behind. The old tellers of the tale have argued for 3,000 years over why he did it. Some say he simply grew tired of her and abandoned her callously. Some say a god commanded him to leave her, for it was fated that Ariadne belonged to another. For indeed, the kindest version of the story tells us that Ariadne, waiting alone and betrayed on that empty shore, was not left to die, that the god Dionysus himself found her there, and loved her, and took her for his own, and raised her at last among the immortals, so that her abandonment became, in the end, her elevation. But whatever comfort that ending offers her, it does not lift the shadow from Theseus. Whether by cruelty or by cowardice, or by the command of a god he did not resist, he took everything Ariadne had given him, the sword, the thread, his very life, and he sailed away and left her sleeping on a beach, exactly as another hero, in another tale, had taken all that Medea gave him and cast her aside. It is the same dark note sounded again, the one who gives us the thread that saves us, forgotten and abandoned the moment we are safe. And a debt like that, in these old stories, is never truly escaped. It is only deferred, and the price of Theseus's forgetting was about to come due, not for the sake of Ariadne, but by the terrible logic of a story in which a man who forgets the person who saved him proves himself to be a man who forgets. Because there was one more thing that Theseus was about to forget, and this one would break his father's heart and his own forever. For as the ship at last drew near to Athens, carrying the triumphant hero home, Theseus forgot the sail. He had promised his father, sworn to him on the shore, that if he lived, he would change the black sail of mourning to a white sail of joy, so that the old king, watching from afar, would know from the first glimpse of the ship on the horizon that his son was alive and coming home. But in the whirl of his victory, in the tumult of everything that had happened, the promise slipped from his mind entirely. The ship sailed on toward Athens, still flying its black sail, the sail of death, the sail that told the watching world that the tribute had failed, and the children were dead, and Theseus was gone. And on the high cliff above the sea, where he had climbed every single day to watch for his son's return, the old king, Aegeus, stood searching the horizon. And at last he saw it, the little shape of the ship coming home, and he saw the color of its sail, and it was black. In that moment, the old man's heart simply broke. He did not wait, and he did not hope, and he did not send anyone down to the harbor to be sure. He saw the black sail, and he believed with absolute and unbearable certainty that his beloved son was dead, that the boy he had only just found and had sent so fearfully across the sea had been devoured by the monster after all and was never coming back. And the grief was more than he could bear. There on the cliff top, the old king threw himself from the edge, down into the sea far below, and drowned. And so, at the very hour that Theseus came home in triumph, having survived the maze and slain the monster and saved his city, his father lay dead in the water, killed, not by any enemy, not by any monster, but by a black sail that should have been white, by a single promise that his victorious son had simply forgotten to keep. And the sea into which the old king fell has been called, from that day to this, the Aegean Sea, after Aegeus, so that the whole of that ocean carries forever the name of a father who died believing a lie, because his son forgot to change a sail. Theseus stepped ashore, expecting to be welcomed by his father, and found instead a city in mourning, and learned that the very thing he had forgotten had killed the man he loved most in all the world. His triumph turned to ash in his mouth in a single instant. He had won everything, and by his own forgetting, in the same breath, he had lost everything that mattered. Sit for a moment with the terrible symmetry of it. For the tale has been building toward this from its very first line. Theseus survived the monster and the maze, the loud, obvious, external dangers that the whole story seemed to be about. And then he was destroyed, at the peak of his triumph, by forgetting. He forgot Ariadne on her beach, and he forgot the sail on the mast. And the two forgettings are the same forgetting, the same flaw in the same man, a certain carelessness with the people who loved him, and the promises he made to them, a mind so fixed on the great deed and the glory of it that it let the human things, the tender things, the promises simply slip away. The Minotaur never had a chance of destroying Theseus. What destroyed everything he loved was the thing he carried inside himself. Not a monster with the head of a bull, but a small and human and utterly ordinary tendency to forget. And that, perhaps, is the true monster at the center of this maze. We look at the labyrinth, and we imagine that the danger is the beast at its heart, the obvious horror waiting in the dark. But the oldest and wisest tellers of this tale understood that the real labyrinth is the one we carry within us, and the real monster is not the one Ariadne's sword can kill. It is the flaw in our own nature, the carelessness, the forgetting, the failure to keep faith with the ones who gave us the thread, that waits for us at the center of ourselves, and that no sword can slay, and that undoes us not in the darkness of some far-off maze, but in the bright daylight of our own greatest victories. But before we follow Theseus into the long twilight of his later years, the tale turns aside, as the old tellers loved to let it, to the fate of another man caught up in the affair of the labyrinth. The man whose genius had made the whole tragedy possible in the first place. For when King Minos discovered that Theseus had escaped the maze and slain the Minotaur, and that his own daughter Ariadne had fled with the foreigner, he flew into a towering rage, and he demanded to know how it had been done. How had any man walked into the inescapable labyrinth and walked out again alive? And the answer, of course, was the thread. And the secret of the thread had come from one man only, Daedalus, the great craftsman, the very maker of the maze, who had whispered to Ariadne the one way out of his own creation. Minos, betrayed by the genius he had relied upon, resolved that Daedalus would never again give away his secrets. And so he took the maze-maker, and he imprisoned him, some say in a high tower, and some say, with a bitter and perfect irony, in the very labyrinth that Daedalus himself had built, so that the greatest craftsman in the world was now trapped in the greatest prison in the world, which were one and the same thing, made by his own hands. And with him he imprisoned his young son, a boy named Icarus. Now Daedalus was not a man to be defeated by any prison, even his own. He studied the problem, as he studied every problem, with the cold and brilliant patience of genius. And he saw that Minos ruled the land and ruled the sea, and that there was no escaping Crete by any road or any ship. But there was one road, Daedalus realized, that even the mighty Minos did not rule. Minos may own the earth and the water, he said, but he does not own the sky. And so, in secret, the craftsman began to build. He gathered feathers, from the largest to the smallest, and he laid them in rows and bound them together with thread, and sealed them with wax, curving them into the great shape he had studied so long in the flight of birds, until he had made what no man had ever made before. Wings, 2 great pairs of wings, one for himself and one for his son, by which a man might do the thing that men had only ever dreamed of, and rise up off the earth and fly. And when the wings were finished and fitted to their shoulders, and the day of escape had come, Daedalus turned to his son and gave him a warning. The warning that is the whole heart of the tale, and that echoes across the years everything this story has been trying to say, is fly the middle way, he told the boy. Do not fly too low, or the damp of the sea will soak your feathers and drag you down into the waves. And do not fly too high, or the heat of the sun will melt the wax that holds your wings together, and you will fall. Keep to the middle path, Icarus. Stay close to me, and do not forget. And they rose up off the cliffs of Crete, the father and the son, on their man-made wings, out over the open sea. And it must have been the most glorious thing that any mortal had ever felt. The whole earth falling away below, the wind lifting them, the blue water shining far beneath their feet, free at last, flying like the very gods. And for a while the boy flew close to his father, as he had been told. But he was young, and the joy of it was too much for him, and slowly, without quite meaning to. He forgot. He forgot the warning, drunk on the wonder of flight. Higher and higher he climbed, up toward the great burning face of the sun itself, wanting to touch it, wanting more of the glory. And as he rose, the sun grew hotter, and the wax that held his wings began to soften, and then to melt, and one by one the feathers began to loosen, and slip away, and drift down through the empty air. And Icarus beat his arms harder, but there were no longer any wings upon them, and he hung for a moment in the high bright air, and then he fell. Down and down he fell, out of the sky he had loved too much, past his father's helpless reaching hands, down into the sea far below, which closed over him and swallowed him and drowned him. And Daedalus, flying on, turned and saw only the feathers scattering on the water, and understood, and cried out his son's name into the empty sky. And there was no answer. The greatest craftsman in the world, who could build wings to escape any prison, could not build a thing to bring his boy back out of the sea. And that stretch of ocean, too, was given a name, the Icarian Sea, so that yet another father's grief was written forever into the water, over a child who forgot a warning and flew too high. Notice how the same note sounds again, in a different key. Icarus was not killed by any monster or any enemy. He was undone, exactly as Theseus was, and exactly as Aegeus was, by a single act of forgetting. A warning, let slip in the joy of the moment. A middle path, abandoned for the glory of the height. The sky did not destroy Icarus. His own forgetting did. And so even here, in a story within the story, the maze shows us its deepest truth once more. That the monster we most need to fear is so often not out there in the dark at all, but the small human flaw we carry up with us into the bright and open air. Theseus became king of Athens after his father's death, and by every outward measure he was a great one. He was, the Athenians remembered ever after, the hero who had united their scattered towns into a single great city, who had given them laws and institutions, and made Athens strong. In the memory of his people, he was a founder, a civilizer, a king, second in glory only to the gods. And he had great adventures still before him. He sailed far to the east against the Amazons, the fierce nation of warrior women, and from that campaign he brought home an Amazon queen, Antiope, who bore him a son, and the Amazons, in their fury, came sweeping down upon Athens itself to reclaim their lost sister. And the city fought a desperate war in its own streets before the invaders were at last driven off. He was numbered among the great heroes of his age, present at the famous gatherings and the famous hunts, a name spoken in the same breath as the mightiest men of the world. But the deeds of his later years grew rasher, and more reckless and less wise, as though the discipline that had carried him through the labyrinth had slowly loosened its hold on him with age and pride. For in these later years Theseus formed the great friendship of his life with a man named Pirithous, a king as bold and as reckless as himself. And the two of them, growing older but not wiser, made a mad and arrogant pact. They swore that each of them would take for a wife no less than a daughter of Zeus himself, and that they would help each other do it, whatever the cost. For Theseus, this meant the carrying off of a young girl named Helen, the same Helen who would one day grown to womanhood, become the most beautiful woman in the world and the cause of the Trojan War, whom Theseus abducted while she was still a child, and who was later rescued and carried home by her brothers. But it was the second half of the mad pact that would prove the most disastrous of all. For Pirithous, not to be outdone, declared that the daughter of Zeus, that he desired for his own wife, was Persephone, the queen of the dead herself, the bride of Hades, the ruler of the whole dark kingdom of the underworld. And Theseus, bound by his oath and too proud to talk his friend out of the madness, went down with him into the land of the dead, the two aging heroes descending alive into the kingdom from which no living man was meant to return, on a fool's errand to steal the wife of the Lord of Death. And Hades, the cold king of the underworld, was not fooled, and he was not merciful, and he did not need to be. He received the two arrogant heroes with a terrible, quiet courtesy. He invited them as honored guests to sit and rest a while upon two great stone chairs. And they sat. And the moment they sat, they found they could not rise again, for these were the chairs of forgetfulness, and whoever sat upon them was held fast to the cold stone, their strength drained away, their very memory dissolving, so that little by little the two heroes forgot who they were and why they had come, and everything they had ever done or loved, their minds emptying out into a gray and endless blank as they sat frozen in the dark, unable to move, unable to remember, unable to leave. And there Theseus sat, the great hero of Athens, the slayer of the Minotaur, forgotten by the world above, and forgetting the world himself, trapped in the very kingdom of forgetting for years upon years, growing into the stone. Do you see how the story keeps returning, again and again, to the same deep chord? The man whose forgetting killed his father, who forgot the woman who gave him the thread. That same man ends by being swallowed alive by forgetfulness itself, held fast in a chair of oblivion at the bottom of the world. It is as though the tale were determined to make his oldest flaw into his final prison. In the end, it was only the strength of another that freed him. For the mighty Heracles, passing through the underworld on the last of his own great labors, found Theseus fixed to the chair, and by main force tore him loose from the stone, though he left a part of Theseus behind on it, and could not free Pirithous at all, who was left to sit in the dark and forget forever. Theseus came back up into the light of the living world at last, but he came back diminished, older, a shadow of the hero he had been, returning to an Athens that had learned in his long absence to do without him. But if you follow his story, past its triumphant middle and on toward its end, you find that the shadow that fell on that day of the black sail never truly lifted. The later years of Theseus are a long, slow gathering of sorrows, and nearly all of them turn, in one way or another, on the same flaw, on love betrayed, on promises broken, on a hardness of heart and a carelessness with the people bound to him. His household was struck by the deepest tragedy of all, and it is a tale worth telling in full, for it shows the flaw of Theseus turned at last upon his own blood. In his later years, he took a second wife, and she was Phaedra, a princess of Crete, and a sister, as it happened, of the very Ariadne he had abandoned sleeping on the shore of Naxos so many years before, as though the debt of that abandonment had followed him home and seated itself at his own table. And Theseus had a son from the Amazon queen, a young man named Hippolytus, pure and proud, a devoted hunter who had sworn himself to the virgin goddess of the hunt and scorned all thought of love. But Phaedra, by a curse of the goddess of love, who was angered by the young man's coldness, was seized against her will by a helpless and consuming passion for her own stepson, Hippolytus. It was a torment she had never asked for, and fought with all her strength, and when at last the young man learned of it, he recoiled from her in horror and disgust. And Phaedra, drowning in shame and fearing exposure, made a fatal and terrible choice. Rather than bear the disgrace, she took her own life, and she left behind a letter, a lie written in her final despair, accusing the innocent Hippolytus of the very crime she herself had suffered, claiming that he had assaulted her and that she died of the dishonor. And here the old flaw of Theseus rose up one last time and did its worst. He came home to find his wife dead and her accusation in his hand. And he did not stop, and he did not question, and he did not go to his son and look him in the eyes and ask for the truth, just as he had once returned cruelty to the bandits without mercy, just as he had judged swiftly and struck hard all his life, so now he judged his own son in an instant, and believed the letter, and in his blind grief and rage he called down upon Hippolytus one of 3 curses that his father Poseidon, the sea god, had long ago granted him. And the sea god heard and honored the curse, as the young man drove his chariot along the shore, protesting his innocence to a father who would not listen. A great bull rose up out of the sea that ran through this whole family's sorrows, and terrified the horses, so that they bolted and shattered the chariot and dragged the innocent young man to his death upon the rocks. And only afterward, only when his son lay broken and dying before him, did the truth come out. At last, too late, always too late, that Hippolytus had been innocent all along, and that Theseus had murdered his own faithful son with a word spoken in haste. On the strength of a lie, he had been too proud and too rash to question. Father and son were reconciled only in the very last moments, as the boy died, forgiving the father who had killed him. And Theseus was left, once again, standing over a body he had loved, undone once again by his own swiftness, his own hardness, his own failure to stop and to ask and to trust. The same qualities that had made him a hero on the deadly road had made him, in the end, the destroyer of his own house. The same swift, severe judgment that had served him so well against the bandits on the road. The same certainty, the same hardness, the same failure of mercy and of patience, turned inward upon his own family and tore it apart. And at the very last, the great hero who had once been the pride of Athens ended his life as an exile, driven from the very city he had made great, abandoned by the people he had once saved, cast out and alone. He died on a distant island, far from home. Some say treacherously pushed from a cliff into the sea, the same death, the death, by falling into the water, that his father had died of grief so many years before. The hero who slew the Minotaur, who walked the deadly road and cleansed it of monsters, who united Athens and gave it its laws, died forgotten and alone on a foreign shore, all his glory long behind him, all the people who had loved him, lost or betrayed or dead. And so we return, at the end, to the cliff where we began, and to the old king, watching the horizon for the color of a sail, and to the question that the whole long tale has been quietly asking. What was the real danger in the story of Theseus? We are told, and we tell our children, that it is a tale about a brave hero who went into a maze and killed a monster. And so it is. But that is the smallest part of it, and the easiest. The monster was slain in a single scene, in the dark, and forgotten. What the tale truly turns upon, from the bull that a king could not bear to give up, to the sail that a son forgot to change, is something far quieter and far closer to home than any Minotaur. It is about the promises we make to the people who love us, and whether we keep them. It is about the thread that others place in our hands to carry us out of the dark, and whether we remember, once we are safe in the light, who it was that gave it to us. Theseus was given a thread by a woman who loved him, and it saved his life, and he left her sleeping on a beach. He was given a promise to keep by a father who loved him, and he forgot it, and his father died. He could master any monster and walk any deadly road. What he could never quite master was the small, faithful, unglamorous work of keeping faith, of remembering, in the joy of his own triumphs, the people to whom he owed them. And there is a warning in that, tucked into the oldest layer of the story, that reaches all the way across the centuries to us. For we will, most of us, never face a monster in a maze. But every one of us has been handed a thread, more than once, by someone who loved us. A kindness, a sacrifice, a promise trusted to us. And every one of us knows how easy it is, in the bright rush of our own lives, to sail away and forget the one who gave it. The tale of Theseus asks us, gently and from very far away, to be more careful than he was, to remember the thread, to keep the promise, to change the sail. Rest now. Let the sound of the sea that took the old king and gave its name to his grief, rise and fall and carry you gently down into sleep. And as you drift, remember kindly all the hands that have ever placed a thread in yours to lead you out of the dark. And resolve, as the hero of this old tale never quite managed to, not to forget them.